After that is a very broad, normal EQ. It's kind of a happy face EQ. To me, this is the sound of the console. It's a Pultec emulation. I actually like Pultec plugins a lot more than I like the Pultec hardware. I'm a big fan of the Lang EQs, which is the same passive equalizer topology for the circuit, but the makeup amplifier is tube in a Pultec and solid state in the Lang. And I actually find the Langs to be a lot tighter. Pultec seem to ring a little bit, down in the low end especially, but the plugins are generally a little tighter. And no one's bothered to model the Lang yet. Hint, hint, get on it. So this is just plus 2.5 at 100 and plus 4, very broad at 10. So it's almost like a shelf at 10. So this is going to be pretty drastic. And it ends up sounding like drastic level, but it's just EQ. So it's a little unfair doing this after the fact, because there's so much going on in the frequency spectrum that I would have fixed on individual tracks if this weren't there. But why do it individually if you can do it across the mix? And why not do it immediately so that this is just what your mix sounds like from the very beginning? It makes perfect sense to me. And then last but not least, on the end is Oxford Limiter. It's set as though it's doing very, very little. I'm actually bringing down the input 1/4 dB, like that's going to help. The output ceiling is set to 0.1 dB. It's just to keep the red lights off, basically. If you're anything within 0.1 dB of digital zero, the red lights come on, and that makes me look like I don't know what I'm doing. So how clever am I to never have the red lights come on? The other thing, other than it's the slowest attack, fastest release, I've got auto gain off, auto comp off. So it's exactly what I give it. It just does the amount of limiting it needs to do to keep it at 0.1 dB below clipping. And then the last part of this, the Oxford Limiter, as opposed to, I can't remember what they call just their basic limiter, this has the inflator circuit in it, just the enhanced fader. So I've got a little bit of enhancement going on too. So I'm going to bypass this. You're going to notice immediately the red lights come on, but that doesn't mean I don't know what I'm doing. So here you go. So one of the things you can notice right away, other than the fact that the red lights come on, is this is actually a big part of how I'm lengthening the kick and the snare. The kick and snare are very, very loud in the mix without this. And without the limiter, they just come poking out. And they're too loud, and they're too short, and they're not really helping. With the limiter, that's doing this final smush to kind of keep them there because it's overshooting by so much. You can see in the middle, it's probably getting up to 4 or 5 dB of gain reduction on those peaks. And that's really a big part of the sound of this mix. Sometimes it's a lot more subtle. You take it off and all you really hear is that you're losing the inflator, but in this case it's actually doing quite a bit of limiting. There you go. That is the sound of the console, and just so you can get a feel for all of that put together. And each one of those on its own isn't doing a huge amount, but together it's kind of ridiculous how much is going on there. So you can see this is actually a big part of my mix, and I'm fine with that. So now we're just going to leave that on till the end of time, and let's start breaking this mix down. I'm going to mute using my VCAs, my big groups of instruments, and let's just go look at the drums for a bit. So the drum kit, it's pretty standard what's going on. It's really well recorded, I've got to say, and it's very stylized in the way it's recorded, which is pretty cool. Really quickly, you can see it's a pretty traditional kit. There are a couple tracks I've added, which we'll get to in a second. There's kick in, kick out. There's snare top, snare bottom. Toms, 2 toms here and a 3rd tom here, which only gets hit once, I think. Then hi-hat, which I'm not using that microphone. Stereo overheads. Ride and hat mics, which I'm not using. And then room. which I'm using just in places. And then we've got this reamp, which we'll listen to in a minute, but it's pretty cool, actually. It's just sort of an ambient reamp. So here's what the kit sounds like. So you can hear pretty stylized. Because there are no cymbals in a lot of these sections, you've got the ring of the toms and the overheads and stuff that you wouldn't normally actually get to hear, which is pretty cool. Then I'm going to play into that little build section, which has the pushes and the push and release, push and release. And one of the things that I use for an effect sometimes is this drums dirt, which is basically just a high-pass EQ into a lo-fi for a little bit of clipping, and then into an iZotope Trash for a ridiculous amount of clipping. So I don't know why that lo-fi is still around. And then an EQ sucking out all of the nasty mid-range that's been created in this plugin, in the iZotope Trash. I'm only using it to beef up the kit in those little pushes and then in the choruses. So I'm going to play that coming and going, and just randomly we'll look at that first because it's coming and going, so I'll bypass the automation afterwards. So here's that section. All right, and here's that same thing where the drums dirt won't unmute. So it still sounds cool, but what you'll notice is that the cymbals don't push as much. It kind of leans forward with it. That hat really jumps out, and it needs that because it's pretty dark and there's a lot of other stuff going on. So in context, that drums dirt is really helping the kit kind of keep up. A lot of what I do with these these parallel compressors and things like that is to try and make it so that, in this case, the drum kit gets bigger to keep up with the other instruments, and then the vocal keeps up with the band as a whole and things like that. So these things will come and go, and what they're doing is just building level and excitement, not so that you notice them coming and going, but so that you don't think you're missing anything when you get to the next section. And it's not the same as just turning up the drum kit. If I did that, what you would have is a loud, dry drum kit. But instead, drum kit stays the same level, but it just gets thick underneath everything else. So it's a hallmark of my mixes that they're quite dense, and this is why. But for me, it really helps keep the excitement going. The other thing I'm doing is bringing in the room tracks just for those pushes. And so again, you don't notice those coming and going, but if they didn't happen, sad. Happy. It's subtle, and I don't know that you would say, oh, you're turning stuff on and off. But it just sounds like all of a sudden the drummer is beating the crap out of the drums, which probably was.